knowledge that archaeologists gain from ethnoarchaeology, how does that actually help when you're excavating a tell, an archaeological site in the Middle East? Well, it helps quite a bit because you know sort of what to expect as you're excavating. Typically, when you're beginning to excavate the remains of an ancient mud brick house, what you'll see is the outlines of the walls on the ground, and you might also see a couple of, let's say, overturned bricks or random bricks in the middle. As you start excavating, if you find bricks that, let's say, are loose, a brick here, a brick there, obviously it's not part of a wall, it's part of the remains or collapse of a wall. You know that you're digging through material that is trash, that doesn't date to the time when the house was being used. Everything here dates to the time period of abandonment, when the house was no longer in use. As you dig further down, then you might start to hit roof beams, right? Things that are associated with the structure of the house. Maybe we're holding up the roof. Once you get down below what you might consider to be the roof, then you know you're in deposits that date to the time period just when the building was abandoned, right? And so you know that material that you might find underneath dates to the time period when that building was being used. And that's much different than this material, which dates to the period when the house was not being used. So things that you find on the floor, in situ, in place, will give you an idea of what the house was actually being used for and what sorts of activities were going on there. Right? So this is a mud brick house that I excavated in Turkey. Right, with you can see these folks over here, and you could see the outlines of the walls. You could see a hearth, plaster hearth in the floor here. You can see a pillar over here and the niche over here. You have 3 of the 4 walls. The last wall is somewhere in this earth material over here, and you can see the stratigraphic layers that we're going to talk about this week. You could see the stratigraphies, right? So we didn't dig far enough this way to get the entire house, but that's okay because we actually got the stratigraphy showing all the things that we excavated to get to the floor. So you can see the kind of burn layer that was right on top of the floor. That's the deposit from. It shows what the building was being used for. Then on top of that, you've got loose stones and bricks. That's the period of abandonment. So the period after the house was being used. Right? Okay, well, now we're going to look a little bit more at the kinds of ethnoarchaeology one could do. People can do ethnoarchaeology that involves specific or general analogies, right? So with all of ethnoarchaeology, we're using an analogy, a comparison, a substitute, right? So when you're using an analogy, you're saying, okay, the modern hunter and gatherer's trash, right, is equivalent, the modern hunter and gatherer's behavior produces this trash. The ancient trash, therefore, indicates this ancient behavior. Right? So it's essentially an analogy. You have specific and general analogies. Specific analogies are ones like what we saw in the Middle East. Right? That is, they involve cultures that are in the same area, share some similarity in terms of lifestyle, and the same geographic region. Right? And there's cultural continuity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Inuit in the Arctic are very much a good example of a general analogy. Right? In a general analogy, the lifestyle of the ancient people and the modern people might be similar, but the modern people are not descended from the ancient people. There's not cultural continuity. It's not exactly the same, and they don't live in the same geographic region. So, for example, here's Louis Benford, who really, was one of the important people starting the new archaeology. Who's very important in terms of middle range theory, right? Middle range theory is essentially like this translation tool to go from ancient artifacts to the behavior that produced them. Well, in order to understand Ice Age hunters and gatherers in Europe, let's say from 40,000 years ago, obviously can't go to Europe today because the climate's different. People are no longer hunting and gathering in Europe, right? So you can't use a specific analogy. So you have to use a general analogy, and that is using Arctic Ice Age hunters, right? Now these, not Ice Age, but Arctic hunters, Inuit hunters, in the recent past and also today. Now the Inuit, I think, their ancestors came over around 6,000 years ago. So they were part of the more recent migrations into the New World. They're obviously not living exactly the way the ancient Ice Age hunters in Europe lived. There's not a cultural connection. So it's really a general analogy, but at least it will give us an idea of some of the behaviors and help us interpret some of the finds of these ancient Ice Age sites. Now, obviously, there's a lot of changes that have taken place from those pictures from the 1920s and the Inuit today. So the Inuit in the Arctic, they still hunt. They still fish. They still do some whaling. They use modern technology, as you can see here. I'm glad to see she's wearing her helmet on the ATV. So it's not exactly the same, but you can use it as some sort of comparison. And also it's important to realize that, people practice hunting and gathering are not like lost in time or trapped in time or anything like that. They've got active cultures that are changing. So, it's kind of a incorrect belief to say, oh, we'll study these hunters and gatherers. They're essentially people frozen in time. That's actually not true, as we'll talk more about with the Kung of South America. Okay, so what can we learn from organizing space? Can we look at an ancient Ice Age site and figure out what was going on? Well, this is where the nut site that you guys did comes into play, right? Because Louis Benford actually did essentially that study that you guys replicated. He studied it with the Inuit, and you replicated it with those nuts on campus, right? In order to interpret an archaeological site. Now, he was doing this in relation to an archaeological site that was being excavated, I believe, in France, where what the archaeologists found were hearths, so these fire pits. They found large fragments of bone, and the archaeologists found small fragments of bone. And the initial interpretation was that these were tents around the hearth, right? The hearth was kind of at the entrance of the tent, and the tent was built around it, like you can see here. So this is what he thought this site looked like. When Louis Benford studied the Inuit, what he found is that as people were cracking open bone, right, the small fragments would fall down to the ground right near them, and the larger fragments would be tossed away, right? Either tossed behind them or tossed in front of them. Right? But that the small fragments are the best indication of where people were actually sitting and cracking open nuts or cracking open bones, not where the big bones were. The big bones are actually the trash, right? So when you were looking at this site, many people might get distracted by the big bones. They might say, well, here are the big pieces of bone. This is where people were sitting cracking open the bones. But it's actually where the small fragments are. That's where people were sitting cracking open the bones, because these things were dropping down in front of them. The things that were tossed are, this garbage ends up there, but that's not actually where people were doing the activity. So one of the things that Louis Benford figured out is that how do you identify activity areas? How do you identify where people are actually doing work? Sometimes it's from the small fragments, not the large fragments. So in this scenario, people were sitting at locations 2, 4, 11, and 8. And you could even see in 8 the sort of outline of the person's knees, right, rear, and here's the other knee over here, as they were sitting, cracking open the bone, and then throwing these pieces behind them. So when Louis Benford went back to this archaeological site, he saw that his model, drop-toss model, fit this scenario much better than the hearth and the tent model. And it didn't make any sense really to throw large bones inside of your tent anyway. So he was saying that these were not tents. These were hearth areas where people were cracking open bone. This was sort of an outdoor production area, an outdoor bone processing area. It was not actually where they were sleeping. So that's important because the site was interpreted one way. It turns out that that was probably not correct. Based on the Ethno Archaeology, we have a good idea of actually what was going on. So that was the whole point of the nut site. Some of you might have guessed that the big bones were where people were sitting, and some of you might have seen that based on the small fragments of nuts that were located where you cracked open the nuts and the fact that the big pieces were thrown elsewhere, that actually people were sitting where the small fragments were. Right? Okay, let's look at another specific analogy. The Middle East Mudbrick Village is a good example of a specific analogy because modern day people in Turkey and Syria are living in a similar lifestyle. The climate is fairly similar. The location is the same as the ancient people. And there is some cultural continuity, right? That is the modern day people in Turkey and Syria are descended in some respect, right? There's obviously migrations through time, but in some respect they're descended from those ancient people. Okay, another good example of a specific analogy would be ancient Anasazi or ancient Native American sites in the Southwest and specific Native American tribes, right? So the ancient Anasazi who built places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, they're the ancestors of the Zuni and the Hopi Native Americans. The Navajo came later, after the Anasazi had already kind of changed or developed into the Hopi and the Zuni. So studying the Navajo would not be a good specific analogy to the ancient Anasazi because the Navajo are not descended from the Anasazi, or ancient ones as they're sometimes called, right? The ancient Native Americans from 900 to 1200 AD. The Hopi and the Zuni are descended from them. And when these photographs were taken, so here's ancient Chaco Canyon, and here's a modern, Hopi pueblo. This photo's taken, from the 1920s or a little bit earlier. I've been to some of the Hopi pueblos on the Hopi Nation. They still live on mesa tops in these adobe or essentially mud brick villages, and it's pretty amazing to see. So there's cultural continuity. It's the same geographic region. They're descended from those people. The lifestyle is is very, very similar. So it's a good specific analogy. So if you find something in the ancient site, maybe you could compare it to what's going on in the modern Hopi village and figure out what that thing is. So in some ancient archaeological sites, like we found one of these big flat black stones in an ancient site that I was working on in Arizona when I was a student. And for a while, archaeologists didn't know what these big black flat stones were. But by comparing it to how the Hopi, what the Hopi were doing, they had exactly the same kinds of stones. And they called them piki stones because they were used to make a kind of bread called piki bread, which is almost like a phyllo dough kind of. If you've ever had the Greek spanakopita, that very, very light, crispy dough, it's the same thing but made out of corn. So here's her bowl of cornmeal next to her. This Hopi woman is kind of greasing up this. It's essentially a griddle made out of stone, the fire underneath. And she's pouring over the batter and making this very light, thin bread out of the cornmeal. And this is the piki bread that you end up with, made out of the blue corn you can see here. So using the same exact artifact, you can see what modern people are using that thing for, and then you're able to determine, oh, this must be what this thing we found in the archaeological site is. Again, there is cultural change, though. So some Hopi, when we were working in Arizona, said when you dig up an ancient ceremonial structure called a kiva, take the floor stones off of the floor and you'll find a cache of important sacred objects in there. And we did that, but there were no pits or objects buried beneath the floor. So that's something that probably is more recent and doesn't go back to ancient times. So these are some of the, I wouldn't say dangers. It's not like a danger you're going to die or something. It's more, the things you should keep in mind when you're doing ethnoarchaeology, right? That you have to be careful. One, with these analogies, it's not going to be exact. It's a rough comparison. And even with specific analogies, people change through time. So it's still not going to be exact in that aspect as well. So it's not going to be 100% accurate, but it's better than nothing. That's essentially what we have to think about with ethnoarchaeology. So when we look at, for example, the Kungsan who live in South Africa, there's a lot of debate about the Kungsan because they are hunters and gatherers. They've been used a lot for ethnoarchaeology. But some people debate, right? Some people believe that they've been hunters and gatherers for hundreds of years or thousands of years, maybe even going all the way back to original hunters and gatherers in South Africa. Other people believe that they did farming a few hundred years ago, but as new peoples came into their area, they were forced into the desert. And in the desert, they could only make a living by hunting and gathering. It's not wet enough to actually farm. So they were sort of forced to take up hunting and gathering again after people moved in. And so these people believe that the Kung are not a people that are sort of quote unquote trapped in time or been hunters and gatherers for hundreds or thousands of years, that this is a more recent thing. Either way, you can't assume that it's going to be identical to an archaeological site. You're just getting kind of an estimate of what kinds of behaviors do hunters and gatherers engage in, what kind of material culture do they have, what kind of trash do they produce, how does that relate to archaeology, right? Archaeologists studied the Kung, one specific tribe of Kung who in the 70s became farmers, right? Maybe if you believe the first or the second theory, became farmers again. The first theory became farmers for the first time, right? But they moved from hunting and gathering to farming, and archaeologists noticed the types of changes that took place in the material culture. It gives us a little bit of an idea of what kinds of things happen and how we can, when people move from hunting and gathering to farming, and how we could look at this archaeologically. So before 1970, they were hunters and gatherers. The hunters and gatherers typically can't accumulate lots of material because they're mobile. They move from one place to another, following their food. Their shelters, therefore, are temporary, not permanent, because they do move from different sites to different sites. Typically in this village, there's about 25 to 30 people. Sharing is very important. No one has more power than anyone else. And it looked like the hearths and the shelters centered around an open area, right? So you can see the hearths, the X. You can see the huts. So the entryways are facing each other. And there's a kind of a communal, almost ethic in the architecture and the way the community is designed. After 1975, they were settled down permanently. They had permanent houses. They were farmers. And this radically changed the way the community was set up. Now they could store things. They started to accumulate more material possessions. They started to have more personal wealth. They were more territorial in terms of their farmland. And this changed in the kinds of houses and also the way the village was organized. So during agriculture, you can see that the houses are further spaced apart. so they're a further distance away. There's more importance placed on storage and personal property. And also, the entryways are not all facing the middle towards each other. A lot of times they're facing towards where their farms are or to where their fields are. Right? And so, if we see this kind of thing archaeologically, it might give us a good indication as to the social things that are going on in a community. Right? So, that's ethnoarchaeology and experimental archaeology. The other thing we're going to talk about this week is excavation. So, we're going to have a little bit of videos about excavation. You're going to do a couple of labs this week to kind of hone that down a little bit. And that will be coming up in the next series of videos.